Hello, this is part of a collaboration that I'm doing with Daniel Greene. We sent each other recommendations of weird fantasy or science fiction books that we weren't sure how the other one was going to feel about, and now we're just going to discuss it. So stay tuned after my own thoughts to see me talk about this with Daniel. And don't forget to check out his video where I convinced him to read Hell's Gate by David Weber. That one, that's not like stuff he's read before. It's kind of fun. So, A Canticle for Leibowitz is kind of hard to describe, or at least it's hard to describe in any sort of succinct way. There are parts of it that I liked. There's parts of it that I loved. There are parts of it that just bored me. There are parts that were really interesting or thought-provoking. There were parts that were cliched and weird, but there were also parts that were unlike anything I'd seen before. Like, Canticle for Leibowitz is kind of all over the place. Overall, I would say I enjoyed it, but it's a strange book, and I'll say right up front, it's not for everybody. And part of the reason for that is that it's not really one story, it's actually three stories, which are very loosely connected, and they happen centuries apart from one another. Like, we have part one, which is a couple hundred years after a nuclear apocalypse, and then we have part two is a couple hundred years after that, and part three is after that, and by the time part three comes around, civilization has more or less rebuilt itself, and we have modern technology again, and humans have gone into space and stuff. It's kind of like Dune. If you've ever read the Dune books, like, they take place over thousands of years, but they are still connected by some themes, and overall we're just watching this society change and evolve, and the story is not so much about the characters going on a journey as it is just watching this society, watching these people change and grow over time. However, this is a science fiction novel that was written in the 50s, and as such, it has to be depressing. So by the time we get to the ending, man, I can only describe the ending as depression incarnate. It's not super pleasant, but you know what? I enjoyed getting to that point. And just to be clear, I do like some of the big themes, big ideas here. I do like following this society's growth and evolution over time, but at the same time, again, this just isn't for everyone. It's kind of an unfocused story. I'm not going to call it a mess or say it's scattershot or anything like that, but it is unfocused, and I feel that's something you should be aware of going into it. So I guess I should talk about what it's actually about. Part one is about a monk named Brother Francis, who is part of a Catholic order called the Order of Leibowitz, who, at the beginning of the story, he's not a saint yet, but he is being considered for sainthood, and basically their job is just to preserve knowledge, because it's a couple hundred years after a nuclear apocalypse, and a lot of knowledge was destroyed, so they're just trying to preserve it and help it, move on and be available for subsequent generations, let's say. And then we get to part two, which is more about, I suppose it's grander in scale, you'd say. It's more about political maneuvering and different city-states trying to, conquer other places and grow an actual empire, with the Order of Leibowitz still being, at the center of it. And then part three, I don't really want to talk about here because of spoilers, but it is, again, more about the broader political stuff that goes on in the world, but we get a lot less detail about the actual politics that are going on, and it's more just looking at the aftermath and seeing how normal people deal with all of the more important people, I guess you'd say, making decisions that affect them. But back to part one. So Brother Francis is in the Order of Leibowitz, and he comes across a mysterious traveler in the desert who some people think might be an apparition of Leibowitz, and this is a problem because some people think that might delay Leibowitz being canonized, which is becoming an actual saint. And then some weird, crazy stuff happens with him. Again, it's kind of an unfocused story. It's more a series of vignettes where we're just following this guy's life than anything. Like I said, this book is largely about just watching society evolve, but it's always focused on and always following the Order of Leibowitz, later on the Order of Saint Leibowitz, because, minor spoiler, he does become officially canonized in between part one and part two. But again, it's more about watching this society evolve, and it's only really focused on these guys, which is kind of a mixed bag. It's good because it gives a focal point and allows us to, follow this one group of people. Even if we grow attached to these characters and then they're gone later, at least we're seeing that the thing that they helped build and preserve and, I don't know, raise up from its humble beginnings is still there, so we still feel some connection to it. So in that sense, it's good. However, at the same time, because we're so focused on just the Order of Leibowitz, it feels like some of the developments in the rest of society are falling by the wayside. Because, for example, like I said, in part 2, we are seeing a lot of political maneuvering. So we get a lot of details about how these various city-states are trying to conquer their neighbors or pacify their neighbors or just, otherwise maneuvering to give themselves an advantage of some sort. And I really liked it. I thought that was pretty good. But then in part 3, we're seeing stuff on an even grander scale, but we're getting very, very little in the way of details. Like, we have a country called the Atlantic Confederacy, which is vaguely in what is now the United States. And then there's another country called the Asian Coalition, which I guess is supposed to vaguely be China. And they're locked in some sort of Cold War, and have been for a while by the time part 3 of the story starts. But we don't know much beyond that. And as a result of this, events, especially bigger events, just sort of happen, and we don't know much about the maneuvering and minutia that's going on, which I found disappointing because I liked that in part 2. And also we are missing out on seeing how their society has changed and evolved. Again, we're just focusing on this one Catholic order, which is a very, very small slice of the population, so I don't feel we really got a sense of how average people live in this time period, whereas in part 1 and part 2 of the story I thought we did. Let's go back to Dune for a second, because this book and the first Dune book were only written a couple years apart from one another. So in Dune, we have the main actual story, which is, at least the first book, we have the main actual story, which is this political struggle. It's this conflict involving House Atreides and involving Paul and his father and Baron Harkonnen and all them, And this story is very good. At the same time, the story is the lens through which we see this weird society. We see their rejection of certain types of technology and the way they embrace other types. We see the way that they are much more religious than we are today, but their religion is also really weird and kind of out there. And so we still get all these big themes and these big interesting ideas, but even if you don't like those or you don't really care about them, you still have the actual story there, the actual main political conflict between these noble houses, and you can still enjoy it and like the book for that. But with Canticle for Leibowitz, we don't really have that, especially in part 3. And by having the story split into 3 parts, we kind of lose out on getting invested in the characters and stuff, so it just winds up making the whole thing feel more unfocused. And again, I understand why the author just stayed focused on this one order of Catholic monks, because that does give us something to be grounded with, but it's still not great. Because again, in Dune, we're grounded with just a couple actual specific characters, even though it's taking place over thousands of years. That said, it is a very funny book. Like, there's a lot of passages where the author is making dry observations and he's poking fun at stuff and he's pointing out contradictions in society or in people's belief systems, and it's a lot of fun. There were a couple of passages I could have read, but I'm just going to read you this one. When the first starship was born as an engineering drawing, it became plain that no institution except government had the means or the funds to build them, that no profit was to be derived from transporting colonies to extrasolar planets for purposes of interstellar mercantilism. Nevertheless, the Asian rulers had sent the first colony ship. Then in the west the cry was heard, "Are we to let the inferior races inherit the stars?" There had been a brief flurry of starship launchings as colonies of black people, brown, white, and yellow people were hurled into the sky toward the Centaur in the name of racism. Afterwards, geneticists had wryly demonstrated that, since each racial group was so small that unless their descendants intermarried, each would undergo deteriorative genetic drift due to inbreeding on the colony planet, the racists had made crossbreeding necessary to survival. That is a funny passage, and also keep in mind this book was published in 1959, so saying something like that would have been a lot more revolutionary, like a much bigger deal. It would have been a lot more progressive back then than it would be considered today. So overall, yeah, it's a funny book. Like even at the parts that were a little dull and I wasn't super into them, the humor did keep me going through it. So I liked that, especially because right around the time I read this book, I also read Wind in Truth, and the humor in that book is less good, let's say. It's less good. So, in broad strokes, I did like this book. I do like A Canticle for Leibowitz. But a lot of the minutia was just weird or dull or just, I don't know. It's weird. Like, there's a lot of weird stuff in this book. Like, there's subplots where there's a subplot about Francis getting spanked and another one about him getting robbed on the road, which goes on for quite a while. There's a sequence where a priest has a really, really long argument with somebody else about euthanasia and why he thinks it's bad. There's an immortal Jewish guy is in this story. This story has an immortal Jewish guy. I don't think they ever actually explain where his immortality comes from. He just is an immortal guy who hangs around, and I think he's at least implied to be the last Jewish person in the world. There's a woman who is implied to be immune from original sin. Again, that's never really explained. It's just there. And then the ending, as I said earlier, is it's freaking bleak, man. It's really, really bleak. Like, I think it was like I understand the message it was trying to send. It's saying something about like the cyclical nature of history and how humankind is just kind of terrible and possibly doomed. But man, it's bleak. So overall, the book is good, but it left me with some confusing feelings. It left me with a lot of confusing feelings. So I guess I'll add it to my collection of weird science fiction that leaves me with thoughts I don't have the words to adequately express. So let's see how Daniel and I agree and disagree on this. Howdy, friends. Hello. Oh, wait, maybe that was bad timing. Daniel was taking a glass of water.
Sorry.
Whatever. We're going. We're going. It's fine. It's fine. Howdy, friends. It's me, James. You've already been watching me, and this is Daniel Greene. Say hello, Daniel Greene.
Hello, how's it going?
It's going good. Why don't you introduce yourself real quick?
I am the fantasy news occasional book review guy on YouTube. You can find me by just putting in my name, Daniel Greene, and I'm here to talk about one of my favorite sci-fi books with James. One that is, I agree with his pre-recording assessment, weird.
Yeah, it's weird. And also, this is part of a collaboration. I recommended that he read Hell's Gate by David Weber. So if you go over to his channel, you can go watch us discuss that and see his thoughts on it. And he recommended to me A Canticle for Leibowitz. And yeah, like you said, this is just a weird book. It's like after a nuclear apocalypse, it's a couple hundred years in the future. There's an order of Catholic monks called the Order of Saint Leibowitz, or at first it's just called the Order of Leibowitz. Technically, it doesn't become a saint until partway through. Whatever, that's not super important. And they're just there to preserve knowledge, and then some strange things happen. I think that's the best and only real way I can think to introduce this book to people.
It's like a more bizarre, less focused Hyperion with heavier religious themes and more to say about, I would say, a very cynical view of humanity and our cyclical nature of
Yes.
falling apart and hitting very dark times. And honestly, one of the reasons I recommended this was I was like, it feels apt. Let's talk about this book right now because it feels a little bit apt with
Yeah.
what we're going through. But yeah, it's not a traditional narrative where you're following one character. I think it's three short stories put together in three different spans of time. And the first is the only one where we are following. It's the first is the only one where it's pre-Saint Leibowitz, correct?
Yeah. The first part is where you're following a guy named Brother Francis, and that's the most
Yes.
focused one. And then you get to part two, and that's more about like the political machinations of this world. And part two is a couple hundred years after part one. And then part three is also about the political machinations of this world and how that eventually causes everything to fall apart once again, even though the apocalypse has already happened once. And man, the ending of this book is I would describe it as weaponized depression. Like it's not even the most grim or the most dark thing I've ever read, but it just feels so resigned to its fate. It's just like, yep, this is what humanity's like. This is what human civilization is going to keep doing forever. And it just felt, man, like I feel like the author needed to get on some medication or something. But I feel that way about a lot of science fiction that was written in this time period. Because I believe this book was published in 1959, and a lot of science fiction that came out at that time was just dark and depressing.
Yeah, it's there's a recent quote from a channel I follow, Red Letter Media, where someone said, "I think the world is too depressing now for people to believe in the future of the original Star Trek," which I kind of actually agree with. And this kind of feels like more where we're like people's psychology is currently, which is, we have these upswings that we go down, and we just hope the next upswing is higher than the last down. And I kind of love this book because of how cynical it is in a way, and also how much it's pulling from like religion and, real historic stuff where like previously in times of great depravity, there have been monasteries that have been strongholds for knowledge, and they try desperately to keep our collective zeitgeist at a point where, if we reach a point where in Canticle for Leibowitz, being seen as literate for a while is a bad thing and people will kill you for it. And in the future, they're like, okay, we need to hold on to these books to a point where people stop killing people for being literate so that we can again learn to make like an engine. And then you keep jumping forward. And I feel like this book came out the 50s. I think like it won the Hugo in 1961. We
Yeah.
can go spoilers here. I think it's
Okay.
safe. If it's over 60, 50 years old, 60 years old, we can talk spoilers in my opinion.
Okay.
But in like the final leap forward, they have gotten further than we have because there's like starships and there's stuff going on that's way futuristic.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's still all these horrible consequences from the Great Burning. Is that what it's called? Or
I,
the
I believe so, yeah.
yeah.
But like the world being destroyed the first time, and then later a lot of knowledge being destroyed afterwards.
And what I found to be kind of true is it seemed like it seems like they got to a point where things were better if you were in like the upper class, but if you were just one of these like mutants wandering around the world, things are worse than ever. And it's like, the bottom class is shit on all the harder, and the upper class managed to recover, do better, get in starships, and once again they lead us to nuclear warfare. And it's just this. I mean, you can tell it was published in the Cold War.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I wouldn't say this book is like pro-religion, but it seems to be
No.
leaning a little bit towards that because it feels like it's saying that the Order of Saint Leibowitz, if nothing else, is at least a stabilizing force because, like, sure, people will die, but these institutions can stay around a lot longer, and it is able to hold on to knowledge. And even if the Order itself doesn't manage to actually change the world or save anything or fix anything, it is at least still there because while at the end of the book, again, spoilers, there's another nuclear war and civilization is wiped out again, but this time humans are able to go out and colonize other planets and stuff. So the Order of St. Leibowitz just takes what remnants it has and what knowledge it can, and it goes off to another world. So it's a little bit more hopeful than you might think at first glance. And again, it's saying like the order is around, knowledge will still be preserved, and I don't think it's pro-religion, but it doesn't seem like it's being anti-religion either, at least not entirely. Okay, we're back. Sorry about that.
It's just Zoom being Zoom. So I have a lot to say about what you were touching on there because no, sorry, you were in the middle of a thought. Go ahead and finish if you'd like to.
Well, I was saying that the book isn't entirely anti-religion, but it doesn't seem to take a super, or excuse me, the book isn't entirely pro-religion, but it is critical of them a little bit. That's
Yeah,
pretty much
and
all I was saying.
I feel like it's the definition of a very using religion as just like a tool, an aspect of storytelling. Because yes, they are this herald of protecting knowledge, but there's a very substantial plot beat where like someone comes in and is like, "Hey, I've found this whole like archive of additional knowledge, and I was led there by this person." And they're like, "Oh, it must have been a reincarnation of our saint and all this stuff," and they're exaggerating and exaggerating. He's
Yeah.
like, "No, stop doing it. No, God damn it. No, this was just me finding some
I
stuff."
don't think a
Um,
Catholic monk would say, "God damn it," he'd get in trouble for that.
You know what I mean? And so there's also like commentary here on the tendency within religion, especially to kind of reach further and push an agenda of a certain kind. When in reality, it was just this person's like, "Hey, I found an archive of knowledge from Leibowitz." And oh my God, if you want religious imagery though and religious like pulling, there's some fairly blunt ones as well. Like at the end, there's someone like getting the dust off their sandals, which is a
Oh
reference,
yeah.
and then they're also directly stating something about the passing of the glory of the world as they're shooting off into space to try and like preserve human knowledge. And it's like, okay, it's the most on the nose religious references you could possibly
Yeah.
make.
Yeah. It's pretty on the nose at times, but it is occasionally it's more subtle. So,
Yeah.
I'll give it credit for that. And one thing I thought was kind of interesting was that in the way that it's not really pro or anti-religion is that we see throughout the three different time periods the story takes place and we see three different leaders of the Order of St.
Yeah.
Leibowitz. In part one, we have a guy named Arcos who is just kind of a stubborn asshole. And like you were saying, he's some people are trying to say like, oh no, it's an incarnation of Saint Leibowitz, and he's kind of against that, but because it might actually make it more difficult for Leibowitz to be beatified, which means to actually become a saint. And he's just being a stubborn asshole about this, and he's not willing to accept anything. And then in part two, it's a guy named Dom Paulo who comes across as like really feckless, and he just is completely subjugated by the government of his time period. And then in part three, it's led by a guy named Zerchi, who isn't really in charge of anything, but at the same time, he understands that he's not really in charge of anything, and he manages to do the best he can to help people while the world is collapsing around them. And so we just see like these three very different figures who all have their own weaknesses and their own strengths, and it just I don't know. It's an interesting way of looking at not religion itself, but religious authorities and the way that they interact with the world.
Yeah, I agree. And this is also one that I have long wanted to see adapted. I think this would make a great miniseries. I would love to watch this actually and like in a modern lens because I feel like it's a message that obviously is about the grand scale trajectory of mankind and our tendency to make the same mistakes. History repeats itself. And at the same time, I feel like it does also need a little bit of polishing in some sense. There are some aspects to the story that I don't think have aged perfectly,
Yeah.
and it also on a I'm trying to remember because it's been so long since I read it. If the writing really struck me as beautiful, or if it was very just workman-like fine prose. But if I remember
Uh,
correctly, it's the latter.
I thought it was pretty good for the most
Okay.
part. Like you're right. It hasn't aged super well in some ways, and I feel like if this were to be written today, it would be the book would be a little bit longer, and there
Mhm.
are parts of it that would be shifted around. Let's say because. I mean, there's parts of this that are weirdly progressive for the time it was written. Like, there's a whole passage explaining why racism is stupid, or
Yeah.
actually, I think there's more than one. But at the same time, I'm not saying the book is anti-Semitic. I'm just saying it has the vague hint of anti-Semitism at a few points because
Yeah.
obviously the name Leibowitz that's pretty obviously a Jewish name, and it's confirmed that in the backstory the guy Saint Leibowitz, who was just a regular guy, was Jewish, but he becomes a Catholic saint, which just feels kind of like they're erasing his ethno-religious background a little bit, and I'm like,
Yeah.
that's a little iffy, but again it's hard to say if like the author is trying to do it or if it's just the characters doing it.
It.
And
Yeah.
also, there's one guy who is in this book. Again, spoilers. There's an immortal Jewish guy in this book who is implied to be the only Jewish guy who's still alive, and I don't think they ever explain why he's immortal. He just is.
Yeah, that's one of the religious things that I just figured I've not read enough religious text to understand. And then on top of that, there is someone who's implied to be the new Virgin Mary for Earth
Yeah,
when
yeah.
the actual monastery, is that the right word for it, falls. And there's this two-headed mutant that's implied to have had a virgin birth going on. And that's a friendly reminder. This is in the time of science fiction where sci-fi was weird, was
Yeah,
very, very weird.
yeah.
And so yeah, the I took the Jewish person becoming a part of a Catholic monastery to be some kind of really fumbled metaphor for like the progression of like, when Jewish people kind of became the Christian movement pre and post Jesus. But that was me reading this 8 years ago. I don't know if that holds up now or if that's something I'd stand
Yeah.
by. Because there is some clumsiness to, I feel, the religious handling specifically in this book. It uses religion as a tool to commentate on humanity, and I feel like what it says about humanity is profound and great. But I never got the impressions that M. Miller, that's his name, I believe,
Uh,
was a
yeah.
particularly religiously knowledgeable person.
Yeah. Again, it's hard to say because like this was written in a time period where religion was more important in American
Yeah.
society, but at the same time, it was written in a time period where Catholicism suffered a lot more bigotry, or
Yeah,
excuse me, discrimination than it does today. Like a lot of people back then really just hated Catholics. So it is kind of
yep,
funny to imagine Catholicism being the religion that maintains itself and continues after the apocalypse. But I think
yeah.
that maybe Walter Miller was just saying like, yeah, they have actual institutions backing them up, and there's a whole hierarchy. Like it's much more organized in Catholicism than it is in most other sects of Christianity. So maybe that's the point he was making, was that if you don't have an institution to preserve knowledge, that knowledge will die.
Yeah, if you're unfamiliar with American history, anyone listening to this, there was a big scandal, I believe, around Kennedy getting elected because people were afraid he would be subservient to the Pope, and it's just the people thought, oh, a president subservient to the Pope because he's Catholic. So
I mean, it
they're
goes back further than that. I mean,
oh, for
like
sure.
the Ku Klux Klan mostly hated black people, but they also really, really hated Catholics and got into
I
a lot
didn't
of
know
fights.
that.
Yeah, they don't focus on that as much nowadays, but back in the day, yeah, they really, really hated Catholics. Or if you've seen the movie Gangs of New York, that is
Yes.
largely about American nativists hating Catholics.
It's because yeah, it's so strange to see how this is a book that I feel like reads very differently now overall than it did when it was first published because
Yeah,
of specifically the themes it's using, the fact that it's having Catholics, Jewish people in it. It is something that's walking a line that is going to continue to recontextualize itself. It has aged in some ways, but I don't think that means it's not something that should be read. To me, this is a very important science fiction book to read to see some of the more different angles that science fiction can be used for in a literary sense. Because, a ton of people read Dune or The Expanse and stuff like that, and they don't necessarily come across stories like this that are the odd children that science fiction is spewed out. And there's a ton of, sorry, unrelated slightly. I found a ton of parallels to this in Canticle Leibowitz to the Foundation series in terms of a lot of like the commentary on like preserving knowledge and the destruction of mankind is inevitable. I, off the top of my head, I believe Foundation came out first, but I want to see if there's influence there because there was a lot, and not on like the writing and actual story, but just in terms of like what is being said that felt super similar to me.
well, I think that's largely just because, as you were saying, these came out during the Cold War, and so the end
Yeah,
of the world and end of civilization was probably at the forefront of people's minds. And
yeah,
way back in the day, maybe they would have just retreated into religious fervor for that. But this was during a time where religion, again, it was still bigger back in the 50s and 60s than it is today, but it was starting to decline in importance.
yeah.
And so people were just going like, okay, well, how can we try and preserve civilization? How can we try and preserve a small part of the knowledge? And how can we tell ourselves that we mattered and that humanity mattered?
Yeah, I mean, God, this book came. I'm actually contextualizing my head more and more. This book came out before Beatlemania.
Yeah,
This
yeah,
was a old book. Hippies weren't even a thing yet. God
yeah,
damn.
yeah. It was
Um,
several years before Dune, even. And I mean, I like
wow,
Dune.
yeah.
This book reminds me of Dune in some ways, and that they're both much more about big ideas than they are about characters or like actual plot. And
Mhm.
they take place over the course of hundreds or thousands of years. And it wouldn't surprise me if there was some influence on Dune coming from this book. But overall, yeah, like if you're a person that is into Dune, maybe check out Canticle for Leibowitz.
Yeah, it's a good recommendation. I would not have called right away. Although to comment on something you said earlier about how like I think you said something about like how this book coming out today would be different. First of all, each short story would be its own book.
Yeah.
It would also have an intercollected like universe sequel spinoff.
Oh
There'd be
yes.
franchise going on with some little Leibowitz dolls that people could
Yeah.
buy.
Yeah, there'd probably be a lot more action in there. It would be more character focused. There would be like a whole subplot about discovering how the world ended, which, like, you wouldn't really need that. But I feel like, yeah, a lot of modern authors would probably throw that in there for better or for worse.
Well, that's actually a really cool point because like this book does not it like a lot of apocalypse books, like The Road even, it's an apocalyptic book, but it doesn't really focus on the event of the apocalypse much. It's all about the aftermath.
Yeah,
Which is I guess that's just a setting I prefer for my apocalypse stories. Like whenever I hear a book is about the end of the world and it's like it happens in the book, that's less interesting to me than people just trying to get through. I don't even need you to name what happened. Like The Road never does, and I think that's a fabulous choice. And I kind of like this as well, where it just feels like we're along with people to struggle through the aftermath of our own mistakes.
Yeah, and weirdly enough, I don't. Sorry if this feels like I'm getting off topic, but the
Hmm?
Maximum Ride books, those are not amazing books, right? But in the second to last book, they're trying to save the world, the whole series, and in the second to last book, they actually fail, and the final book is after the world has ended, and they just have to deal with the consequences of their failure. And the last book, your face is lighting up. Don't get excited. The last book is
Oh,
not
okay.
good, but that idea of them having to deal with the consequences of failing to save the world is really, really interesting. It's not something
Yeah.
you see a lot. And I
I
feel like that there are some thematic parallels with Canticle for Leibowitz. Like at the end, yeah, the Order of Saint Leibowitz couldn't do anything. They couldn't save the world. They couldn't really do anything to help most of the people that were suffering, but they could preserve a little bit of knowledge and save a few people, and just that's the best they could do.
See, I think I disagree with you a little bit. I see the ending as a little more cynical because to me, it seems like they've been suffering for over this massive expanse of time we're covering through the three short stories, and all they're set up to do in the future is do it again in the black void of space. And it's just like,
Yeah.
like it's
Yeah.
another giant send off where they're gonna do their best, and maybe it could be better this time, but was society we saw at the end of this book as it destroyed itself better than the society that came before? I wouldn't say so.
Well,
To me,
obviously, every society is going to be imperfect, but remember, throughout the book, as we're seeing people learn, we're seeing them excuse me, we're seeing them experience the joy of discovery. We're
yeah.
seeing them experience the joy and happiness and success that comes with learning new things and preserving that. So I feel like being able to do that again and again and again, obviously, that doesn't counteract all the suffering, and I wouldn't argue it makes it worth it either, but that is a silver lining to it.
No, I want you to argue it makes it worth it. I want
No, no, I'm
to.
not, because it's not worth it. I'm not going to argue that.
And there is this really nice, like I'd say the most human scene for me, at least as it stands out in my memory, is someone just using a treadmill, making an invention, and it's like this discovery moment of like we've done it, like this is the start, cool.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the beauty of sci-fi writing in this dystopian landscape. Like if you write a book that's just so depressing, I Am Legend has a moment that stands out to me where like he finally gets the dog inside, and it's just like he got the dog inside, right?
Mhm.
Similar vibe here where it's like the light bulb, he got the light bulb, and we should all be thrilled.
Yeah.
Spoilers for I Am Legend, but that dog then dies, and
Yeah.
it's sad.
Yeah. I mean, again, that's a very old book, and the movies adaptations are also pretty old, so it's fine. You can spoil that. It's
Well, I
not
would
wrong.
also argue Canticle for Leibowitz is not like I hesitate to say this about a lot of books. You can't really spoil this one. This is an experience book to me because
Yeah.
it's about the ideas. It's not about the hero's journey or anything like that. It's about, okay, what is this author communicating with me and you engaging with it. So I
Okay.
think it's
Yeah.
really hard to spoil Canticle for Leibowitz.
That's fair. Journey before destination and all that.
Yeah, all
Uh,
that.
I also just wanted to say that this is a pretty funny book. Like, there's a lot of parts where there's passages that are just full of dry humor and the author making very wry observations. Like I mentioned earlier, he has passages where he talks about how racism is stupid. Like that, it's a fun book at times, and I think that helps take the edge off some of the cynicism and some of the more depressing aspects of it.
Yeah, and to me, it was another nice reminder that this person understands humans because I maintain the worse and darker the world gets, the funnier people get. It's the similar thing where it's like during eras of war, you get the best music. I also think you get the best comedy because the way we are able to cope and deal with depravity and terribleness is just, well, we can take the piss out of each other, and that's one way to cope. I always just kind of find that to be a realistic representation of how humans act in general. I'm sure people will disagree with me there, but I think whenever we're facing existential dread, the only real thing we can do is poke fun at it.
I see where you're coming from there. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I think I've said everything I have to say about it. Do you have any last thoughts?
Yeah, if anyone knows where to get a really nice hardback of this book, I've been hunting one for ages and I've not found it. So send it my way. I would be very appreciative of that because this is one where I do want to get like a collector's edition someday.
Okay. Well, Daniel, thank you for coming over. Thanks for recommending this book to me. I thought it was very interesting. It's again weird, but I did overall like it. Make sure you go to his channel so you can watch us talk about Hell's Gate by David Weber. He's never read any David Weber stuff before, so I'm hoping maybe I can pull him onto the train. Maybe this is me getting him into military science fiction. But
I'll say what I say all the time. I do plan on finishing at least it's called the Multiverse series, right?
I
Pretty
think so, yeah.
straightforward name. Yeah,
Yeah.
I do plan on finishing it. It's just when will that happen? The
Uh,
2028, let's call it that. We'll go 2028. That's my
all right.
promise.
Yeah, and rate the video, comment, subscribe if you haven't already. Go to Daniel's channel and then rate his videos, comment on them, and subscribe to him. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.